Lady Eleanor Ainsworth had long ago decided that her soul was the colour of dust motes, dancing in a sliver of late afternoon sun. Present, visible, but ultimately weightless and ignored. She stood near a marble column in the Duchess of Pemberley's ballroom, a glass of lukewarm champagne held in her gloved hand. The crystal felt slick with condensation, a small, cold reality in a world of suffocating warmth and noise. The orchestra was a relentless tide of strings and woodwinds, pulling the brightly coloured lords and ladies into its swirling eddy. Laughter, sharp and glittering, burst like bubbles in the air. Eleanor watched them all, a ghost at the feast of life. She was 24, an age at which society began to write its epitaphs for unmarried women. She was a spinster in waiting. Her engagement to Lord Harrington was meant to be her salvation. It was, by all accounts, a spectacular match. He was handsome, charming, heir to a respectable fortune, and her family had sung his praises until the tune was etched into the very bones of their house. To them, he was a solution, a neat and tidy end to the problem of Eleanor. To her, he was a beautifully crafted cage. He looked at her and saw a suitable frame for his name, a placid face to sit at the head of his table. He never saw the restless mind behind her quiet eyes, nor the way her fingers itched to hold a charcoal pencil instead of an embroidery needle. He saw a Lady Harrington, not an Eleanor. Resignation had settled over her like a fine layer of silt, clouding the vibrant colours of her spirit until all was a muted grey. Her mother had cornered her by the potted ferns an hour earlier, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "You must smile more, Eleanor. Lord Harrington will think you morose. A happy countenance is a wife's greatest asset." Eleanor had produced the smile as requested. It felt like a mask, brittle and ill-fitting, but it had satisfied her mother. Now, the muscles in her cheeks ached with the effort. She took a small sip of champagne, the bubbles a faint sting on her tongue. Her gaze drifted over the crowd, cataloguing the pairings, the flirtations, the subtle negotiations of the marriage market playing out under the glittering chandeliers. It was then that the room seemed to hold its breath. The tide of chatter receded for a moment, the music faltering just a beat. The change was palpable, a sudden drop in temperature. Eleanor followed the collective gaze of the room toward the grand entrance. He stood framed in the archway, a figure carved from shadow and severity. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood. He was a man spoken of in whispers, a creature of myth within the very society he deigned to grace with his presence. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and, it was said, impossibly cold. His face was all harsh lines and stark angles, his eyes dark and unreadable. He did not smile. He simply was. He owned half of London and, rumour had it, the souls of several politicians. His presence was not an arrival, it was an occupation. The Duke's gaze swept the room, dismissive and clinical, as if he were a hawk surveying a field of mice. For a fleeting, unnerving second, his eyes met Eleanor's from across the expanse of polished floor. There was no warmth, no recognition, only a brief, intense assessment that made her feel as though he had seen straight through the placid facade to the weary soul beneath. Then he moved on, and the moment was gone. Eleanor's heart gave a strange, unwelcome lurch. She turned away, her fingers tightening on her glass. The air suddenly felt too thick to breathe, the perfume and pomade cloying in her throat. She needed to escape, if only for a moment. Lord Harrington was somewhere across the room, holding court with a circle of admirers, his laughter the loudest in the group. He would not miss her. He rarely did. She slipped away from her column, her silk slippers making no sound on the marble. She found a side door, partially concealed by a heavy velvet curtain, and pushed it open. It led to a conservatory, a world of glass and wrought iron, filled with the slumbering shapes of exotic plants. The air here was cool and damp, smelling of earth and night-blooming jasmine. It was a relief. The conservatory was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the glass panes and the distant glow of the ballroom. She walked deeper into the green shadows, running a hand over the waxy leaf of a plant she could not name. Here, she could let the mask fall. Here, she could be the weightless, ignored dust mote, and it was a comfort. But she was not alone. From behind a towering palm, she heard voices, a low, feminine giggle, and a deeper, familiar male chuckle. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her hand hovering over the leaf. "You are wicked, James," a woman's voice purred. It was Lady Beatrice Croft, a diamond of the first water, known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambition. "Only when properly inspired," came the reply, and Eleanor's carefully constructed world fractured into 1,000 pieces. It was Lord Harrington's voice, her fiancé. "And what of your little brown mouse?" Lady Beatrice asked, her tone dripping with saccharine poison. "Will she not be wondering where you have gone?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. A little brown mouse. Is that what she was to him? Harrington's laughter was dismissive, cruel. "Lady Ainsworth is a creature of duty, not passion. She knows her place. She is suitable. A quiet background for a man's life. One does not concern oneself with the background." The words were stones, each one striking her with a physical force. Suitable. A background. He had not just betrayed her with another woman. He had betrayed the very idea of her, dismissed her entire being as inconsequential. The pain was sharp and sudden, a blade twisting in her chest. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. A cold, clarifying anger. She heard the rustle of silk, a soft sigh. She did not need to see to know what was happening. She backed away silently, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She had to get away. She could not breathe. She turned, her movements clumsy, and bumped into something solid. No, not something. Someone. A hand shot out, steadying her elbow. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock and humiliation, into the dark, unreadable face of the Duke of Blackwood. He stood in the deeper shadows near the entrance, a silent sentinel who had clearly been there for some time. He had heard everything. Mortification washed over her, hot and suffocating. Her carefully maintained composure, the only armor she possessed, was gone. He had seen her laid bare, had witnessed the casual dismantling of her dignity. She expected a flicker of pity, perhaps a hint of contemptuous amusement. She saw neither. His expression was as impassive as granite. The sounds from behind the palm ceased, and moments later, Lord Harrington and Lady Beatrice emerged, their clothes slightly dishevelled. Harrington froze when he saw them, his face paling. "Your Grace," he stammered, offering a clumsy bow. He glanced at Eleanor, a flicker of panic in his eyes, before his expression settled into one of annoyed defiance. "Eleanor, taking the air." Eleanor could not find her voice. The words were trapped behind a wall of ice in her throat. The Duke of Blackwood did not acknowledge Harrington at all. His gaze remained fixed on Eleanor's face, his grip still firm on her elbow, a silent anchor in her swirling sea of shock. He seemed to be waiting. Finally, Eleanor found a sliver of strength. She pulled her arm from his grasp and looked directly at the man who was to be her husband. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but as clear and cold as winter ice. Our engagement is at an end, Lord Harrington. A gasp came from Lady Beatrice. Harrington's face flushed with anger. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. You are overwrought. I have never been more clear-headed in my life, she replied, her voice gaining strength. She turned to leave, to flee the suffocating glass house and the ruins of her future. You will regret this, Harrington called after her, his voice laced with venom. You will have nothing. No one will have you. Eleanor kept walking. She did not look back. She had almost reached the door back to the ballroom when the Duke's low voice stopped her. Lady Ainsworth. She paused, her back to him, unable to face him again. He is unworthy of you, the Duke said, his voice devoid of emotion. A simple statement of fact. She waited for him to say more, to offer condolences, to walk away. He did neither. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. Then he spoke again, and the world tilted on its axis. Marry me instead. Eleanor turned slowly, certain she had misheard. The Duke of Blackwood stood just a few feet away, his expression unchanged. The moonlight cast half of his face in silver, the other in shadow. He looked like a creature of two worlds, neither of them gentle. I beg your pardon, she whispered, the words barely audible. It is a logical solution, he continued, as if discussing a business merger. You require a husband to salvage your reputation. I require a duchess. Your family is respectable, your character unimpeachable. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement. She stared at him, bewildered. This was madness. He was the most powerful, most enigmatic man in England, a man who could have any woman he chose. And he was proposing a marriage of convenience to her, a jilted spinster, in a dimly lit conservatory. Why? She asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. Why her? Why now? Why at all? I have my reasons, he said, his voice giving nothing away. You need not concern yourself with them. You need only provide an answer. Yes or no? Her mind reeled. Harrington's cruel words echoed in her ears. No one will have you. And here was the Duke of Blackwood, the one man no one could have, offering her his name. It was an escape. A different cage, perhaps, grander and colder, but a cage of her own choosing. It was a shield against the pity, the scandal, the ruin that awaited her. She looked at his unyielding face, at the darkness in his eyes that promised nothing of affection or warmth, only stability. It was a choice between a slow, public death by 1,000 cuts of humiliation, or a quiet, unknown life with this formidable stranger. Yes, she heard herself say, the word a thin, reedy sound in the fragrant air. Yes, Your Grace, I will marry you. The Duke gave a single sharp nod, as if a contract had just been sealed. Very well. My solicitor will call upon your father in the morning. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone amongst the silent, watching plants, the ghost of his impossible proposition hanging in the air like the scent of jasmine. Her heart hammered not with fear, but with a terrifying, unfamiliar surge of something that felt dangerously like hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of cold formality. The scandal of her broken engagement to Lord Harrington was a wildfire, consuming the gossip columns for a day, only to be utterly extinguished by the thunderclap announcement of her betrothal to the Duke of Blackwood. Society was stunned into a collective silence of awe and disbelief. Eleanor went from being an object of pity to an object of intense, mystified envy. She saw the Duke 3 times before the wedding. Each visit was a stilted, precisely choreographed affair in her family's drawing room, with her mother fluttering nervously in the background. He was impeccably polite, his conversation measured and impersonal. He spoke of settlements and estates, of the running of Blackwood Manor, his ancestral home. He never spoke of himself, and he never asked about her. They were like 2 diplomats negotiating a treaty, not a man and a woman about to be bound for life. Eleanor watched him, trying to find a crack in the granite facade. She found none. His eyes remained shuttered, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. He was a puzzle she could not begin to solve. The wedding was a small, quiet ceremony, at his insistence. Standing beside him at the altar, Eleanor felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a play about her own life. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice. When it was her turn, her own voice trembled only slightly. When he slid the cool, heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was brief and impersonal. His fingers were cold. That night, she was installed in Blackwood Manor. The house was like its master, vast, imposing, and breathtakingly beautiful in a severe, Gothic way. It was a palace of shadows and silence, the halls so long that footsteps echoed into nothingness. She was given a suite of rooms in the east wing, connected by a dressing room to his own suite in the west. A chasm of carpet and mahogany lay between them. He escorted her to her door, the epitome of formal courtesy. "You will find your new maid, Anna, within," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous hallway. "She will see to your needs. If you require anything, you need only ask." He paused, his hand on the doorknob to his own wing. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, something personal. He simply inclined his head. "I trust you'll be comfortable. Good night, Your Grace." He called her Your Grace, not Eleanor. She was a title, a position to be filled. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. She went into her room and did not see him again for 2 days. Life in the manor settled into a strange, silent routine. They took their meals together in a dining hall that could have seated 50, the tables stretching between them like a barren wasteland. The silence was broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. He would read the papers. She would stare at the intricate patterns on her plate. She spent her days exploring the house. She found a library that took her breath away, 2 stories high with towering shelves of books that smelled of leather and time. It was here she felt the first flicker of something other than unease. She would spend hours there, losing herself in worlds of poetry and history. Sometimes she would feel a presence and look up to see him standing in the doorway, watching her. He would never enter. He would just stand there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking away. It was unsettling, the feeling of being observed by a ghost. One afternoon, she was in the library, perched on a ladder to reach a high shelf, when her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound volume of sonnets by a little-known poet she had once mentioned enjoying during one of their stilted, pre-wedding meetings. She had said it in passing, a desperate attempt to fill the silence. He could not possibly remember that. She pulled the book down. It was old, the pages soft with age. Tucked inside was a pressed white heather, a symbol of protection and good luck. There was no note, no explanation. She stood on the ladder, her heart giving a strange, fluttery beat. It was the first sign that the man was not made entirely of stone, the first crack in the armor. A few weeks later, they were forced to attend a dinner at the home of a neighboring earl. It was their first public appearance as a married couple, and Eleanor dreaded it. She knew the whispers would follow them, the curious stares. She felt Harrington's presence before she saw him. He was there with Lady Beatrice, who now wore his ring on her finger. Throughout dinner, Eleanor could feel Lady Beatrice's sharp, malicious gaze on her. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, Beatrice's voice cut across the table, sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "Why, Your Grace," she said, looking directly at Eleanor. "You look so peaceful." I confess, we were all so concerned. After James ended things so abruptly, for you to land on your feet so quickly. It is a testament to your resilience, or perhaps your desperation. The table fell silent, a collective indrawn breath. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sting of humiliation. She opened her mouth to form a reply, some cool, cutting remark to defend the sliver of dignity she had left. But she never got the chance. The Duke, who had been silent beside her, placed his wineglass down with a soft, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look at Lady Beatrice. He continued to slice a piece of meat on his plate, his movements precise and unhurried. "Lord Harrington," he said, his voice a low, chilling murmur that carried to every corner of the table. "A word of advice. Teach your fiancé some manners. The air at my table is cleaner than the company you keep. Should she ever address my wife in such a tone again, you will find that your business interests, your club memberships, and indeed your very welcome in London, will wither and die like unwatered weeds." He paused, then lifted his eyes to meet Harrington's, which had gone wide with shock and fear. "Am I understood?" Harrington, pale as a sheet, could only manage a choked, "Perfectly, Your Grace." The Duke returned to his meal as if nothing had happened. The conversation around the table stuttered back to life, forced and awkward. No one looked at Eleanor, Harrington, or Beatrice for the rest of the evening. On the carriage ride home, the silence between them was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with the weight of his actions. He had defended her. Not just defended her, but utterly demolished her tormentor with a few quiet words. It was a display of raw, ruthless power, all wielded on her behalf. As the carriage rattled over the cobblestones, she dared to look at him. His profile was stark in the flickering lamplight, his expression as impassive as ever. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned his head to look at her. In the shadows of the carriage, his eyes seemed darker, deeper. "He was a fool to let you go," he said, his voice flat. "And his choice of replacement is an insult to intelligence. I do not suffer insults, to myself or to my house." He had not defended her, she realized with a pang of disappointment. He had defended the Duchess of Blackwood. He had protected his own name, his own property. Still, the memory of Harrington's terrified face was a small, guilty pleasure. The crack in his armor was a confusing thing. It did not let in warmth, only more questions. One evening, unable to sleep, she wandered through the moonlit halls of the manor. She found herself in a part of the west wing she had never explored, and came upon a door slightly ajar. A thin line of light spilled into the hallway. Curiosity, an emotion she had not felt keenly in years, propelled her forward. She pushed the door open silently. It was a study, smaller and more personal than the grand library. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the Duke sat in a large leather chair, his back to her. He was not reading. He was staring into the flames, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. She saw his shoulders, usually so straight and rigid, was slumped. There was a weariness about him that she had never seen before. He looked lonely. The powerful, unassailable Duke of Blackwood looked utterly and profoundly alone. As if sensing her presence, he stiffened. He turned his head slowly. When he saw her standing in the doorway, his mask of indifference snapped back into place. But not before she saw the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. It was like seeing a statue bleed. "I am sorry," she whispered, feeling like an intruder. "I could not sleep. I will leave you." "Stay," he said. The word was not a command, but a quiet, almost rough request. She hesitated, then stepped fully into the room, closing the door softly behind her. She walked over to the fireplace, keeping a respectful distance, and warmed her hands before the flames. The silence stretched between them, but it was a companionable quiet, warmed by the firelight. "You spend a great deal of time in the library," he observed, his voice low. "It is my favorite room," she admitted. "I feel at peace there." He nodded, swirling the liquid in his glass. "My mother loved that library. She would read to me in there when I was a boy." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his family. His parents had died years ago in a tragic carriage accident, a piece of society gossip she had heard long ago. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Eleanor offered gently. "She was," he said, and his voice was thick with an old, deep-seated grief. He looked into the fire, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. They were gone so quickly. One moment they were here, the next, just silence. This house has been silent for a very long time. Here it was, another crack, a deep, painful one. This cold, imposing man was a boy who had lost his parents and been left to rattle around in a cavernous, silent house. Her heart ached for him, an unexpected and powerful surge of empathy. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to understand this man. The mystery of him was no longer just a curiosity. It was becoming a necessity. She needed to know why he had chosen her, a woman he barely knew, to share his silence. Gathering all her courage, she turned to face him fully. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his harsh features, softening them. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady. "Alistair." He looked up, surprised that she had used his given name. "I must ask you again," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And I must have an honest answer. Of all the women in England, women with greater beauty, greater fortunes, greater connections, why did you ask me to marry you?" He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he would not answer. He stared into his glass, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all its usual defenses. "Because I have been in love with you for 5 years." The confession fell into the quiet room like a stone into a frozen pond, shattering the surface of everything she thought she knew. Eleanor could only stare at him, her mind blank with shock. It was impossible. It made no sense. He had barely spoken to her in all that time. "I do not understand," she breathed, her hand going to her throat. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound weariness. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were completely unguarded. The darkness in them was not coldness. It was a deep, aching loneliness. "I saw you at your first season," he began, his voice low and raspy with unshed emotion. "You were standing by a window at the Danbury Ball, watching a moth beat itself against the glass. The rest of the room was a cacophony of noise and ambition. But you were in your own quiet world, your expression so full of empathy for that foolish insect. He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating gesture. It sounds absurd, but in that moment, I saw you. Not Lady Ainsworth, the debutante, but you. I saw the intelligence in your eyes, the kindness you tried to hide. I saw a depth that the peacocks in that ballroom could never comprehend. Eleanor's heart was hammering against her ribs, each beat a painful thud. She remembered that night, that moth. She had felt so out of place, so alien. She never imagined anyone had noticed.
I began to watch for you, he continued, his gaze fixed on some distant memory. At balls, at the opera, in the park. I would learn which books you checked out from the lending library. I overheard you debating philosophy with an elderly professor at a garden party. Everyone else saw a quiet, plain girl. I saw a mind on fire. I saw a soul that shimmered. He took a drink from his glass, the movement sharp and sudden. But I knew what I was. Cold, damaged. The silent Duke of Blackwood. The man who buried his heart with his parents. I was no good for you. You deserved sunshine and laughter. A man like Harrington who could charm a room. The name fell like a drop of poison between them. So I kept my distance. I told myself it was enough to simply know you existed in the world. I condemned myself to watching you from afar, and I watched as he courted you. I hated him for it. I hated him for not seeing what he had, for treating you like a pretty ornament. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the moon-drenched gardens. That night in the conservatory, I was there to get some air. I saw you slip inside and my foolish heart compelled me to follow. Just to be near you for a moment without the world watching. And then I heard them. I heard him dismiss you, break you, with such casual cruelty. He turned back to face her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Something inside me snapped. All those years of restraint, of telling myself I was protecting you by staying away, it all burned away. All I could see was your face, the devastation you were trying so hard to hide. It was not a logical solution, Eleanor. It was an act of pure, selfish desperation. I saw my one chance to have you, to protect you, and I took it. I was a coward who hid behind a convenient proposal because I was too terrified to tell you the truth. That my life has been a silent, empty hall, and you were the only music I ever wanted to hear in it. He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. He looked utterly exposed, the powerful Duke stripped away to reveal the raw, vulnerable man beneath. He had built a fortress around his heart, and for her, he had just thrown open the gates. Section Eleanor felt as though the floor had vanished from beneath her feet. Every cold glance, every formal word, every awkward silence was cast in a new, brilliant, heartbreaking light. It hadn't been indifference, it had been reverence. It hadn't been disinterest, it had been iron-willed restraint. He hadn't seen her as a duchess, a title. He had seen her, Eleanor, more clearly than anyone in her entire life. Tears pricked at her eyes, blurring the sight of him standing there, braced for her rejection. She thought of all the times she had felt his eyes on her in the library, not as a warden watching his prisoner, but as a man watching the woman he loved. She thought of the book of sonnets, the pressed flower. It hadn't been a passing thought. It had been a secret offering. She realized she had a secret of her own. She had noticed him, too. In the crush of society, he had been a point of stillness. While other men preened and postured, he observed. She had mistaken his silence for arrogance, but she had been drawn to it nonetheless.
She had sensed a substance to him that men like Harrington entirely lacked. She had been intrigued by the sad, old soul she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. She did not stop until she was standing directly before him, close enough to see the flicker of fear in his dark eyes.
"You think I am a creature of sunshine and laughter," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My entire life I have felt like a ghost, unseen, unheard. I learned to live in the quiet, Alistair. I made my home there." She reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and laid her palm against his cheek. His skin was cool, but a tremor ran through him at her touch. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand as if he were a starving man offered bread. "You were not the only one watching from a distance," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I saw you too. I did not understand what I was seeing, but I saw you." His eyes opened, wide and full of a desperate, dawning hope. "Eleanor?" She did not need to say anything more. The truth was there, in her touch, in her tear-filled eyes. He had spent 5 years in a silent vigil, loving a woman he believed he could never have, while she had been slowly suffocating in a world that refused to see her. They were two lonely souls who had been orbiting each other in the dark, and finally, they had found their way into the light. He raised his own hand to cover hers, his fingers lacing with hers against his skin. His touch was not cold now. It was filled with a desperate warmth. He searched her face, his expression a maelstrom of disbelief and wonder. "All this time," he rasped. "All this wasted time." "It is not wasted if it brought us here," she replied softly. Slowly, hesitantly, he lowered his head. He gave her every chance to pull away, to deny him. She stood her ground, her heart aching with a love she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. When his lips finally met hers, it was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, breathtaking relief. It was gentle, chaste, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of solitude and patience, of years of unspoken words finally finding a voice. It was the closing of a door on a lifetime of loneliness, and the opening of another into a future she had never dared to imagine. When they broke apart, they simply stood there in the firelight, their hands still clasped, their foreheads resting together. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was full. 2 years later, the silence of Blackwood Manor was a distant memory. The vast, echoing halls were now filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fires in every hearth. Laughter, real and frequent, now danced where only echoes had resided. Sunlight, once held at bay by heavy velvet draperies, was now invited in, spilling across polished floors and illuminating the dust motes Eleanor had once thought defined her soul. She was no longer weightless. She was an anchor. She sat in a comfortable armchair in the morning room, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. Her gaze was fixed on her husband. Alistair was on the floor, on his hands and knees, a position of utter indignity for the formidable Duke of Blackwood. And he was the picture of happiness. He was making a low, growling sound, his eyes alight with a playful fire she now knew so well, as their 1-year-old son, Arthur, shrieked with delight and tumbled onto his father's back. Alistair collapsed with a dramatic groan, rolling onto his back and pulling the giggling child onto his chest. Arthur, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's observant grey eyes, patted Alistair's cheek with a chubby hand. "You have defeated me, you tiny tyrant," Alistair declared,
his voice full of mock surrender. The house of Blackwood has fallen. Eleanor smiled, a real, effortless smile that reached her eyes and filled her with a quiet, abiding joy. The man on the floor bore little resemblance to the granite figure she had married.
The coldness had melted away, replaced by a deep well of tenderness and a dry wit that he reserved only for her and their son. He was still a man of few words in public, still the powerful Duke. But here, within the walls of their home, he was simply Alistair. Her Alistair. He caught her watching him, and his smile deepened. It was a look that still, after 2 years, made her heart feel as though it were taking flight. It was a look of pure, unadulterated love. A look that saw all of her and cherished every part. Later that afternoon, they walked in the gardens, Arthur bundled between them, his small hands holding one of each of their fingers. They walked to the hidden garden, the one he had first shown her in the early days of their marriage. It had become her favorite place. It was a wild, beautiful tangle of roses and ivy, a secret haven. Alistair had confessed that he had built it for his mother, and after her death, he had let it go to ruin, unable to bear the sight of it. With Eleanor, he had started tending it again. Together, they had pruned back the overgrown thorns and planted new life. The garden had healed, and so had he. "Do you ever think of him?" Alistair asked quietly, his gaze on the blooming roses. She did not need to ask who he meant. Lord Harrington had married Lady Beatrice, and by all accounts they were miserably suited, their days filled with sharp words and extravagant spending. They were a cautionary tale whispered about in the drawing rooms of London. "No," Eleanor said, and she was surprised to find it was the absolute truth. "He is a character in a book I read a long time ago. The story was not about him. It was about the woman who was finally able to close the cover and walk away." He stopped walking and turned to her, his expression serious. "I am sorry for the years I wasted, Eleanor, for the time we lost because of my cowardice." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You were not a coward, Alistair. You were a man guarding his heart, and I am eternally grateful," she whispered, her voice full of emotion, "that you chose to give it to me." He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, familiar kiss that still held the wonder of that first night in his study. It was a kiss that spoke of shared secrets and quiet mornings, of finding a home not in a place, but in a person. A person's worth, she had learned, was not measured by society's applause or by a suitable match. It was measured in the quiet moments, in the feeling of being truly seen. For 5 years, he had watched over her, a silent guardian she never knew she had. His love had not been a grand public declaration, but a patient, steady flame burning in the dark. And in the end, it was that quiet, constant light that had guided her out of the shadows and into a life more vibrant and full of love than she had ever dreamed possible. It was never too late to begin again.